cats have technically been in Magic ever since the very first set. Although they would not be classified as cats until this set's legend, there have been feline cards dating all the way back to Savannah Lions in Alpha. Since then, the game has seen both humanoid and animal felines both printed with the cat creature type, leading to a wide range of creatures throughout the game's many sets. And today we'll be looking at the best of these cards in Magic. Starting us off at number 10, we have Ajani's Pridemate. This cat soldier costs 1 generic and 1 white mana. While it starts with 2 power and toughness, whenever you gain life you put a +1/+1 counter on this card. And it's important to note that Ajani's Pridemate triggers only once each instance of life gain. So Healing Salve will only give Ajani's Pridemate 1 counter instead of potentially giving it 1 counter for each point of life gained. This means Ajani's Pridemate works best with repeatable sources of life gain, such as Soul Warden. Decks built around gaining life in small bursts use Ajani's Pridemate as a scalable threat that demanded to be answered sooner than later. It saw success in Soul Sister decks, yet would remain mostly a rogue option for most of its life, as other decks surpassed it in the modern metagame. This was until its reprinting in Standard with War of the Spark. From there, Ajani's Pridemate found a home in the power life gain decks propped up by Heliod's Uncrowned. Ajani's Pridemate slotted well into Heroic's life gain decks and even aggressive Pioneer White Weenie decks. Even in formats lacking Soul Warden, in the years since its initial printing, other cards like Daxos, Blessed by the Sun, have filled its spot. With enough gain, Ajani's Pridemate provides a cheap yet potent aggressive threat that buys time for more threatening cards like Heliod. However, oftentimes these life gain decks now choose to forego more high-end threats on the curve for other cards that are similar to Ajani's Pridemate. Voice of the Blessed has the same power and toughness and effect of Ajani's Pridemate, but also further abilities beyond that. However, it also costs 2 white mana, making it less easy to cast than Ajani's Pridemate in multicolored decks. There are other options for effects clearly based on Ajani's Pridemate, such as the legendary Trelasara Moon Dancer. This has led to Ajani's Pridemate both becoming perhaps the most basic and weak of its type, but also spawned a variety of aggressive creatures that in turn now has an entire deck built around the ability that started with Ajani's Pridemate. While perhaps not as relevant itself as other cards are in this list, its legacy and impact on card design and life gain strategies earns it at least the 10th spot on this list. And at number 9, we have Brimaz, King of Oreskos. This legendary cat soldier has 3 power and 4 toughness as well as vigilance, meaning attacks do not cause him to be tapped. Vigilance is a common keyword, but with 2 other abilities to add on to its usefulness since it has an ability for both when he attacks and when he blocks. Both abilities produce a cat soldier creature token with 1 power and 1 toughness, and depending on if Brimaz is attacking or blocking, the token is doing the same. If Brimaz attacks an opponent, there's now another creature attacking the same target, and if Brimaz blocks a creature, the token will now be blocking that same creature. This functionality gives you an extra point of damage on both offense and defense, and allows Brimaz to trade out with or outright kill creatures in combat he otherwise on paper wouldn't be able to deal with. Oftentimes, even when Brimaz dies, he leaves behind 1 or even multiple tokens. This made him into a recurring threat in Legacy's Death and Taxes decks and other decks in both Legacy and Modern back within his initial printing in 2017. However, as the metagame shifted and creatures in mid-range decks grew more potent, the slower value Brimaz offered fell off with time. Death and Taxes had always leaned on equipment plans thanks to the power of Stoneforge Mystic. In recent years, Brimaz has found himself mostly relegated to the Commander format, where he's a mainstay in cat-themed decks. However, the same is obviously true of every card on this list, and thus hardly is any reason to put him any higher than 9th. But thanks to the card's historic relevance in multiple formats, Brimaz is at least deserving of being this high. And at number 8, we have Qasali Pridemage. Qasali Pridemage costs 1 green and 1 white mana for 2 power and toughness cat wizard. It also has the keyword ability Exalted, which says whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gets +1 power and toughness until the end of the turn. It doesn't matter which creature is attacking, as long as the creature attacks alone, it will get the bonus from Exalted. This works with other instances of Exalted, meaning if you have 2 copies of Qasali Pridemage on the battlefield, both will give the bonus to a creature attacking by itself. However, it's Qasali's other ability that has led to its relevance. By paying 1 generic mana and sacrificing Qasali, you can destroy target artifact or enchantment on the battlefield. Generally speaking, with removal for artifacts and enchantments, it can be difficult to decide when and how to run it. Usually, most competitive decks leave their interaction for those types of cards in the sideboard, reasoning that since most decks aren't guaranteed to use artifacts or enchantments, the card might be utterly irrelevant. Disenchant can very easily be a dead card that provides little to no outside value. However, Qasali Pridemage avoids this weakness of more narrow interaction by being a fairly static creature. A 2/2 creature for 2 mana is a standard rate, and in the early stages of the game, it's often only 1 creature at most worth attacking with anyways. And in those cases, most creatures are small enough that the boost provided by Exalted can actually make the difference. And from there, if there is any notable artifact or enchantments to remove, it can be used as interaction. It's Qasali Pridemage's flexibility that has allowed to see play in creature decks for years, working in both aggressive decks for its stat line and cost, and in more toolboxy decks looking for silver bullet options. It being a common also means it's legal in the Pauper format, where it is often used to counter the prevalent Tortured Existence deck in that format. Much like the previous entries in this list, the main points against Qasali Pridemage are the further creatures have since been printed that have a similar or outright better effect. In Legacy in specific, Cathar Commando, being both mono-white as opposed to multicolor and having flash, has allowed it to slide in comfortably into Death and Taxes decks that otherwise would have passed on Qasali Pridemage for needing green mana to cast. Qasali Pridemage still sees active play in aggressive zoo decks in the Pauper format, meaning it still has some homes, even if it has arguably been power crept in recent sets. And at number 7, we have Kaheera the Orphanguard. This card costs 1 generic mana, then costs 2 more hybrid mana. In this case, meaning either green or white mana can be used to pay for Kaheera's colored portion of the mana cost. In return for your mana, you get a 3 power and 2 toughness legendary cat beast that has the aforementioned vigilance keyword. It also gives each other creature you control, that is a cat, elemental, nightmare, dinosaur, or beast, plus 1 power and toughness, as well as vigilance. These creature types in specific were chosen because they were the main non-human creature types of Ikoria and provided support to multiple strategies in the limited format. Of course, Kaheera's relevance comes more from the companion ability it has. Companion was an ability introduced in Ikoria that allowed you to start with the card in your sideboard, and as long as your deck met the card's companion requirements, you'd be able to play the card from your sideboard in a manner similar to a commander. This mechanic was deeply meta-warped in pretty much every format, with 2 of the cats on this list both having companion. It was so warping that eventually the mechanic was nerfed to instead first require you to pay 3 mana to add the companion to your hand from the sideboard instead of playing it directly from the sideboard like initially designed. In fact, companion as a mechanic is so strong that it hardly even matters what Kaheera's effect is. This is made most evident by the fact that Kaheera sees play not in creature-focused decks that benefit from her buff-granted ability, but instead simply because she's a companion that's easy to meet the requirements of. Kaheera's companion requirement is that every creature in your deck be one of the types Kaheera supports, which often means that decks play Kaheera run little to no creatures at all, and the ones that they do are often in the modern format where elementals like Solitude have overtaken the metagame for how powerful and flexible they are. But even Kaheera's most consistent home is in control decks that run almost no creatures at all, leveraging Planeswalkers or cards like Shark Typhoon as non-creature win conditions, and running Kaheera is essentially a free bonus in the sideboard. While this is still quite playable, Kaheera is rarely played on her own merit and is more used for her companion ability, which is why she's only at number 7 on this list. And at number 6, we have Leonin Relic-Warder. Costing 2 white mana, Leonin Relic-Warder is a cat cleric with 2 power and toughness. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile target artifact or enchantment. When Leoric leaves the battlefield, return exile card to the battlefield under its owner's control. This sort of effect, popularized by the card Oblivion Ring, has shown up as a repeated template for card designs. In this case, Leonin trades off being able to hit any sort of permanent in exchange for being both on a creature and having a mana value of just 2. Generally, these effects tend to start at 3 mana, for they tend to be more narrow in what they're allowed to hit, like with Portable Hole only being able to hit things with a mana value of 2 or less. Beyond this, Leonin Relic-Warden's ability is split into 2 separate triggers instead of a single trigger, meaning that if you sacrifice it in response to its own ETB, you can stack the triggers so the return resolves before anything is exiled, and the card Relic-Warden targeted is in turn permanently exiled. It's a narrow workaround that requires a deck to be built around it, but it is a notable bonus that comes from this card's specific templating. However, Leonin Relic-Warden is limited in what card types it can target, and as previously mentioned, artifacts and enchantments often aren't guaranteed to show up in most formats, so Leonin Relic-Warden is usually not the first pick for this kind of effect. That is, except for the Vintage format. Vintage is dominated by powerful artifacts as the only format where the most powerful cards in the game, the Power 9, are legal. Black Lotus and the 5 Moxen are members of the Power 9 and the most powerful mana acceleration ever printed. Leonin Relic-Warden can remove an early Mox Sapphire or any of the other powerful threats produced by the format's ever-present Mishra's Workshop deck. Beyond this, in formats like Commander, Leonin Relic-Warden is also used as an infinite combo piece with Animate Dead. If you reanimate Relic-Warden with Animate Dead, then target the Animate Dead with Relic-Warden's ability, the Animate Dead will be exiled, which then destroys the Relic-Warden, which in turn brings back the Animate Dead, which starts the loop back over. Combined with a Blood Artist's effect, and what was designed to be a narrow hate piece becomes a part of a 3-card infinite combo win, a bleak one that's mostly seen in more casual formats. Coming in at number 5, we have Cauldron Familiar. This cat costs a single black mana and has 1 power and toughness. Whenever it enters the battlefield, every opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. At any time, you may sacrifice a food token to return Cauldron Familiar from the graveyard to the battlefield. Food tokens were introduced into Throne of Eldraine, and Cauldron Familiar was designed to be a recursive body for decks that produce food tokens to use. Players quickly found in the limited environment that Cauldron Familiar was an extremely powerful combo piece with the card Witch's Oven. You could tap Witch's Oven and sacrifice a creature to create a food token, and if the creature's power was 4 or greater, you made 2 food tokens instead. This, combined with Cauldron Familiar, was a slow resource loop in which whenever Cauldron Familiar was about to die to removal, or more often after using it as a chump blocker against a much larger creature, you could choose to sacrifice it to the oven to bring the cat back. This grindy loop would prevent a lot of damage, both from all the combat Cauldron Familiar blocked in, and from the small drain of 1 life every time Cauldron Familiar came back. This, coupled with cards like Mayhem Devil, made food one of the best decks in Standard at the time Eldraine was in rotation, with countless ways to both make food and several payoffs for using them. While Cauldron Familiar was not the primary win condition, it would provide consistent chip damage that throughout the game, as well as a sense of inevitability, Cauldron Familiar's damage was a non-combat way to win in those closer games. Eventually, Cauldron Familiar proved to be such a powerhouse in the format that it was outright banned in the format. However, this was at a time in the Standard format where banning cards was more common than it had been in the past, so this alone isn't enough to prop it up any higher than 5th on this list. And at number 4, we have Displacer Kitten. This cat beast costs 3 generic and 1 blue mana, and has 2 power and toughness. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, Displacer Kitten allows you to exile a non-land permanent you control, then return it onto the battlefield. This is commonly known as flickering or blinking, and can be quite handy for either protecting a card from target removal, or to reuse or refresh a card. Most often, blink effects target creatures and synergize best with creatures with strong enter the battlefield effects. Stoneblade decks using powerful Stoneforge Mystic have adopted Displacer Kitten to get further value out of their equipment package by repeatedly using Stoneforge Mystic's ability to search an equipment to your hand every time she enters the battlefield. In builds of Stoneblade before Displacer Kitten, it generally wasn't worthwhile to blink Stoneforge Mystic since it would take up too many extra slots for minimal value. Whereas with Displacer Kitten, every equipment in the deck, or all the various cheap or outright free instants and sorceries like Force of Will, make it so that in these Eternal formats, it's very easy to use Displacer Kitten's effect multiple times in a turn. In fact, there are whole combo decks built around using Displacer Kitten to perform an infinite loop with Teferi Time Raveler. In those decks, all one has to do is cast a 0 mana non-creature spell, like Mishra's Bauble, to trigger Displacer Kitten to flicker Teferi. Then Teferi can use his -3 ability to bounce Mishra's Bauble back to the hand and draw you a card. Then, since the Bauble costs 0 mana, you can simply cast it again to have Displacer Kitten flicker Teferi and repeat the loop until you've drawn your whole deck. Most blink effects don't interact with Planeswalkers, but Kitten does, and allows you to get around the soft once per turn inherent to using Planeswalkers with loyalty abilities. This combo is efficient enough and uses cards that are already playable enough that decks not dedicated to the combo will run the pieces required for it just as a secondary win condition. And there are several other combination of cards that can combo off of Displacer Kitten. That's simply the most competitively viable option. And at number 3, we have Felidar Guardian. This cat beast has 1 power and 4 toughness with a cost of 3 generic and 1 white mana. When Felidar Guardian enters the battlefield, you may exile another permanent you control and return that card to the battlefield. Much like the previous entry, this cat blinks a permanent, although without other cards assisting its effect, it was unrepeatable. However, Wizards of the Coast had neglected to think about how this card would work with the Planeswalker card, Saheeli Rai, that had been printed in the same block. Her -2 ability creates a token that's a copy of an artifact or creature you control, except it has haste and it is exiled at the beginning of the next end step. When combined with Felidar Guardian, who could enter and reset Saheeli Rai's loyalty and allow her to keep creating more copies of Felidar Guardian with haste, which means they were not even summoning sick and could attack that turn, it made for a potential lethal attack with infinite cats on turn 4 in Standard. Especially at the time in 2017, Standard games ending so quickly was relatively unheard of, and the deck was so dominant that eventually it was banned in Standard outright. While banning cards in Standard has since become a more common occurrence, at the time it was seen as a major sign of format instability when a card was put on the Standard ban list. From there, a few years later, when the Pioneer format was introduced, it didn't take long for Felidar Guardian to be banned in the format as well for similar power level concerns. To this day, Felidar Guardian still sees play with Saheeli Rai in Modern, although in that format she's far less effective given turn 4 kills already common in Modern at the time of Felidar Guardian's printing. However, its dominance of Standard and subsequent banning in 2 formats is enough to justify it being third, despite not being quite so relevant in any formats it's still legal in. And at number 2, we have Leonin Arbiter. Leonin Arbiter is a card commonly referred to as Hate Bear, meaning it's a 2 mana creature, in this case 1 white and 1 generic, for a 2 power and toughness creature with an effect designed to slow down or impede players. In the case of Leonin, its effect makes it so that players cannot search libraries. Leonin Arbiter also allows either player to pay 2 mana to ignore this effect for the turn. Searching libraries is one of the most common effects in competitive Magic the Gathering. In Eternal formats like Modern and Legacy, the fetch lands are the primary form of mana fix in the format, and Leonin Arbiter directly counters them. Most players begin the game with their fetch lands, but now Leonin Arbiter forces them to have 2 mana to even be able to properly use them to grab lands from the deck. This also combos well with the downside of the removal spell Path to Exile. The downside of getting to exile any creature is that its controller is allowed to search the library for a land and put it into the battlefield. Now with Arbiter, they have to have the 2 mana available or else they don't get the trade-off, and Path to Exile is an even cleaner piece of removal. Decks that use Leonin Arbiter tend to focus on playing multiple Hate Bears, and thus also leverage the power of a card called Aether Vial, which can be tapped to play a creature from your hand for free as long as its mana value matches the number of counters on Aether Vial. Often in Hate Bear decks, an Aether Vial stays at 2 counters for most of the game, always threatening Leonin Arbiter in response to someone sacrificing their fetch land. Given it provides counterplay to the most ubiquitous cards in the game, Leonin Arbiter has seen consistent success in pretty much every format it's legal in since its initial printing in Mirrodin. However, there is one cat that has proven to be even more prolific and all the more powerful, so Leonin Arbiter only comes in at second place. And finally, at number 1, we have Lurrus of the Dream Den. Lurrus is another of the companion creatures from Ikoria like the aforementioned Kaheera. This cat nightmare has 3 power and 2 toughness with the mana cost of 1 generic mana, then 2 hybrid mana that can be paid with black or white. Lurrus has lifelink, which means that when it deals damage it gains that much life, but its relevant effect is that during each of your turns you may cast 1 permanent spell with a mana value of 2 or less from your graveyard. This is an extremely potent effect, given that most competitive formats tend to value low mana spells anyway. Because of this, Lurrus's companion cost of each permanent card in your starting deck needing to have a mana value of 2 or less proved to be far from a deal breaker for most competitive decks. Notably, Lurrus only limited your permanent cards, meaning any instant or sorcery could be played regardless of mana value. And as for permanents, decks simply shave their high-end powerful creatures for more low-to-the-ground threats that Lurrus could interact with. Cards like Mishra's Bauble became staples in various types of decks simply because Lurrus was so strong, and Bauble comboed so well with Lurrus, drawing you multiple cards throughout the game when you had nothing else to revive with Lurrus. The card ensured that no matter what, you would have access to recursion and also essentially started the game with an extra card in your hand. Lurrus was quickly banned in multiple formats, eventually getting to the point where it was even banned in Vintage for a period of time. This was especially surprising given that Vintage's main selling point is that it doesn't ban cards for power level reasons, and that every card meant for sanctioned play would be legal or, at most, restricted to a single copy being allowed in the deck. Even after the companion mechanic received its errata, Lurrus was dominant, staying banned in formats it was already banned in and winding up on even more ban lists. The companion nerf did, however, allow it to come off the Vintage ban list, a format where it still sees consistent play to this day. At the time of recording, the only formats Lurrus is currently legal in are Historic, Vintage, and Commander, with every other format currently listed as banned. Many argue that Lurrus is one of the most powerful creatures ever printed, warping most every format around its restrictions because it was so powerful most decks felt like they needed to run it. And as such, there's no doubt that Lurrus of the Dream Den is the strongest cat in Magic the Gathering. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, go ahead and leave a comment down below.